Now it seems to be working a little better, so hopefully now we are live. You can start soon. So few seconds and then just start.
Hi again. I hope you had a nice break, and now we continue with our keynote lecture. So we have Dr. Väyrynen, the education counselor from the Embassy of Finland in Ethiopia, and we have Dr. Hanna Posti-Ahokas, adjunct professor from the University of Helsinki, who is also involved with the organization of the same seminar in the last couple of years. And the session is chaired by Dr. Markku Leskinen from the University of Jyväskylä. Enjoy the lecture, and I give the floor to Markku now.
So thank you. So I'm very pleased to share this session, and I anticipate that we will hear very interesting lectures. So first we welcome Dr. Hanna Posti-Ahokas from the University of Helsinki.
Thank you very much, Markku. It is such a pleasure to join you this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm happy that you are all here. And I would also wish to congratulate the organizers for a wonderful event that you have managed to turn into a fully digital experience that allows many of us to participate in the spirit of inclusion, which is the theme of this year's seminar. My name is Hanna Posti-Ahokas. I currently work at the University of Helsinki in a new international master's program called Changing Education. For the past 3 years, I was very closely involved in organizing the SDG4 seminar, so I'm very happy to join you in this role today. My approach to let me share my screen first. I hope the slides are visible now. My approach to inclusion starts from a fundamental human rights-based approach, and I look at inclusion as an issue of equity to a large extent. On top of the human rights and equity approach, I think of inclusion as something that has to be contextually defined and developed. Inclusion can mean different things in different contexts. And I also think inclusion is very much about giving voice to everyone, and especially to those whose voices are not often heard. In my research, I have looked at issues of inclusion and equity in the context of higher education, international higher education cooperation, higher education pedagogy, and also teacher education. I wanted to remind all of us about two critical UN documents that are guiding our work towards SDG4 and that have themselves informed the formulation of the SDG4 goal. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 and a more recent UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and their articles 26 and 24 particularly are texts that I recommend returning to on regular basis. In the context of teacher education, we should be asking what is our role in ensuring the universal right to education. And it's also important to look into the different ways of approaching and advancing inclusion in different kinds of teacher education systems. teacher education systems vary across the world and across the contexts. But I think there are a lot of similar features if we look at the potential of teacher education in advancing inclusion. Teacher education can be looked at as a critical space to enhance quality across education systems. Teacher education structures educate professionals to the whole education system. We educate teachers with a specialization in special needs, but we also educate all other professionals to the field. And so this is an opportunity to have inclusion as a focus in all programs. And in most countries, teacher education institutions provide both pre-service and in-service training, meaning that we have both future teachers and current teachers involved in the programs, and especially collaborating around the teaching practice. A wonderful idea coming from a review of research on inclusion in teacher education by Simenido was to look at ourselves as being part of the change. Teacher education has the connections to schools and other educational institutions. Teacher education institutions conduct research, and they operate on research basis of the latest research findings, or at least this is the ideal. And although being traditionally rather local or national, teacher education is internationalization very, very fast, and that also brings us some new opportunities to look at inclusion from different perspectives. I'm basing my talk today largely to a recent report that was commissioned by the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report. We had a wonderful team of seven scholars from different parts of the world looking at the different definitions of inclusive education and national and legal policy frameworks that guide teacher education approaches and programs. So we had a multiple case study of 5 countries, namely Argentina, Ethiopia, Ghana, Laos, and Zanzibar. And we did also bring in a few insights from Finland because the work was coordinated in Finland. And I was happy to see 2 members of our team chairing the morning sessions. So you have met already with Sai Juma and Hanna. And you will also meet with Anna Beltran and Claire Shaw this afternoon in one of the thematic sessions. You can get the link to our full report in the end of my presentation. So what did we find through looking at 5 very different teacher education systems across 3 continents? Inclusive education is defined in different ways. Where do we find the definitions? We can find them in legal documents, policies, plans, and strategies. But we also observe that at the country level, the definitions may differ between documents. And sometimes this may due to a deeper, improved understanding of what inclusion means, but sometimes it might also signal inadequate communication between different sectors and different types of processes. What was very encouraging was to see a strong political will to understand inclusion as part of the education system rather than a separate, segregated or parallel system serving only some special groups of learners. All 5 countries recognized the need for trained and qualified teachers to implement inclusion. As Bilal Barakat said in the morning in the presentation, all teachers should be prepared to teach all students. We also observed diversity in the plans, methods, and the extent to which different countries and their teacher education programs provide content related to inclusion. Contrasting the different approaches to the recent UNESCO guidelines, we could see that inclusion is attempted to be introduced as a very broad concept, which was, of course, good news. When we monitor developments in the education, it's always tricky to find something that is measurable. What kind of evidence do we get in order to actually see what happens on the ground? One of our first observations was that we saw a lot of evidence of initiatives around teacher education for inclusion, but it was very difficult to find out the scale of the initiatives. Which percentage of teacher students in a certain country were attending compulsory courses on inclusive education, for example? Which proportion of teachers got in-service training during the summer around a certain topic? And then again, the scale of systems is massive around the world. For example, in Ethiopia, there are close to 700,000 teachers and school leaders only in primary and secondary schools. So we are talking about massive initiatives if we talk about reaching the training on inclusion to everyone in the schools. Another major question is, how do the initiatives influence practice? We do need to follow up on what happens after the training, when newly deployed teachers are starting their work, or when teachers who have attended summer programs return to their classrooms. Is there actually some observable change in the practices? And I think this is an obvious point for research. And this is probably something where teacher education institutions could come in many different countries. Some very promising signals. Inclusion is talked about across the different levels of education, starting from early childhood care and education, all the way to adult and higher education, which definitely is a good sign and tells that we are making efforts towards a whole school approach and a system-wide transformation when we look at inclusion. A project conducted in Laos beautifully reflected on the location of change, saying that developing reflective practice in schools will support the development of professionalism and help to drive the move towards the introduction of more inclusive practices. So inclusion is not something that can be introduced only from top down and from the policies. It is something that has to be reflected on and worked through at the level of individual teachers and individual schools, together with the surrounding society. Another promising signal was to see cross-sectoral collaboration being mentioned in the context of inclusive teacher education. Collaboration, particularly across education and health sectors, was visible in the examples of trainings that we collected. And we were also happy to see extensive international partnerships to support national efforts, especially in the area of in-service teacher training programs. In Laos, there was a large collaboration with USAID. Zanzibar had collaborated with Norway, and Ethiopia and Finland have worked together for decades in the area of inclusive education. Just to give a few examples. So where could we focus if we would really want to generate change and transformation? Focusing on the teacher education institutions themselves and the teacher educators, who are the ones who, to a large extent, determine what kind of content, ideas, ideologies are discussed and present in teacher education programs. I think this could be a space to focus if we really want to generate change and impact. Creating better links between pre-service and in-service training of teachers, having future teachers interact with more experienced teachers could bring in a lot of new insights for both groups. And looking at how teachers, especially the ones who are newly deployed, can better collaborate with the special needs education teachers. And this is a challenge that's very much present in the context of Finland at the moment, according to a professor from University of Oulu. And I think there's a lot more we could do also in our pre-service teacher education programs to have more dialogue between different study programs and study tracks. And again, re-emphasizing the point of following up on what actually happens in the practice of educational institutions after participating in some kinds of trainings. In our report, we provide two main recommendations. The first one looks into what it would take to work towards a systemic transformative approach to inclusion in education. In teacher education, we need to adopt some new and a lot more holistic approaches to thinking about inclusion. Looking beyond teacher education, we should engage and train educational leadership and school personnel at all levels. We should focus on reporting how inclusion is implemented in schools and other educational institutions, and this requires coordinated efforts. And we see a huge potential for teacher education in taking up some of this role in reporting through gathering research evidence and so on. And then let's not forget that education systems don't work in isolation from the societies and the communities. We do need to recognize parents and families as key stakeholders also in development of teacher training and also working together with the health sector and social protection. And our second main recommendation relates to the value of international perspectives and collaboration. We hope, for example, the 5 country cases that we are presenting in our report could serve as an inspiration to other countries and actors. And instead of direct comparisons, let's say numeric comparisons, it may be important to create opportunities for policy practice learning and peer reviews of promising approaches. So going beyond the figures or legal documents, but to have dialogue based on the different approaches. International partnerships are essential for teacher training, and existing partnerships can be developed to broaden their reach. And how do we do it in the current context? I think that there's a lot we can do with blended learning and digital platforms in order to enhance the quality of teacher education for inclusion in different parts of the world. And I think this seminar is an excellent example of such an activity. To conclude, I will return to what a systemic transformation could actually look like in practice. In our report, we have mapped out some of the key elements of transformation, different dimensions of transformative processes. Those could be something like negotiations, definitions of responsibilities, measures of accountability, joint efforts, and training. In order to look how this could be happening in practice, I contacted the head of teacher education department at the University of Jyväskylä and asked her to reflect on how inclusion is tackled in the current teacher education programs at the University of Jyväskylä. And this is what we got from her. Inclusion is a starting point for everything that the department is doing. And inclusion is looked at belongingness to a community. So that's what you can see on top of the slide. And at the bottom of the slide, we are reminded that inclusion is an objective of everything that the department does. And in that, as an objective, inclusion is something that we together create for our shared future. But what is happening between the starting point and reaching the objective? The first items are related to the students. It's about how the program is communicated and introduced, focusing on it being multi-voiced, individualized, aiming at broad professionalism. It's about creating a sense of belonging for each student that starts through being a member of a small home group, focusing on student well-being. And then in the curricular content, inclusiveness and non-discrimination are present across different courses. At the departmental level operations, transparency is critical when we think of inclusive practice and belonging. Students are represented in departmental working groups. Students are also engaged in actual research and development projects, and connections to schools with their diverse realities are maintained through the teaching practice and some other activities. For the staff, inclusivity is about working towards one's strengths, participating in decision making and taking responsibility, and about recognizing the different voices and richness of the networks that each of the staff members bring into the community. And then it can be also about some very practical recognition and response to some special needs, including physical mobility, sensory sensitivity, and allergies, and for example, providing occupational counseling. So I think this slide reminds us really well how complex inclusion actually is, and how we cannot only be focusing on having some people participate or not participate, or access a program, or how it is not only about the curricular content, but it is a combination of a lot of different things. So this is what I would like to end my talk with. Here's some references, and I very much look forward to listening to Sai's lecture about how teachers as professionals work with the idea of inclusion. Thank you from my side.
Thank you very much, Hanna. And if you have some quick questions to Hanna, please write down in this home space environment those questions. But meanwhile, I would like to ask first question to Hanna. you mentioned in the end that this is a highly complex phenomenon. And if you think about teacher education, what is your highest priority? Where the change should start, so to say? So, because we cannot do everything at the same time, but what is the starting point if the goal is to build more inclusive, teachers, profession that they manage well in classrooms, etc.?
Thank you. That's a very good question. What our faculty in Helsinki is currently doing is that each study program is asked to develop their own plan for advancing equity and non-discrimination. And what we have done in our program is to try to combine the perspectives of the staff and the administration with the perspective of the students and their future learning needs in order to somehow find the core of things. Our students came up with a beautiful shared agreement on the way they want to work as a group and contribute to the whole of the program. So I think what combine these two examples is a genuine dialogue between different kinds of groups. It's about generating spaces where everyone can participate despite their ability or speed of being able to respond and so on. So I think dialogue is really in the core. And when do we have the time for that? And this is a challenge to the leadership to allow this dialogue to happen. But this is what I believe in right at the moment. Okay.
So inclusive dialogue is your favorite starting point. Yeah. I do not see any questions at the moment, but we will have a room for questions in the end of this session, so that perhaps we give floor to Sai next, and I'm sure that you will find questions to Hanna also, and please write them down, and we will have a general discussion after Sai's presentation. So please, Sai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Markku. And good afternoon, everybody. It's very exciting to be giving a keynote speech at this event again. I think last time I presented a keynote lecture in this event about 10 years ago. And that 10 years is only a very brief part of my very, very long involvement in developing inclusive education. I have been working around it for a long time. I have recently returned from Ethiopia from a 3-year assignment, and I will be returning back to the University of Helsinki in a couple of weeks' time. But in my role in Ethiopia, I had an opportunity to meet teachers and teacher educators in my role as the co-chair of the education sector co-chair. It's a group that coordinates external funding for the Ethiopian education sector. And it also coordinates various initiatives so that they are aligned with the policies of the government. In this role, I met teachers, I met school leaders in a very, very different contexts. I have also met a lot of teachers in Finland and in other countries across the world. And it always keeps inspiring me to listen to their thinking about inclusive education and the efforts they have made in pursuing inclusive education, and that keeps me going. I think we have enormous resource there, and I will start sharing my screen. I hope it will work. Is it okay? Okay. So the title of this presentation, What I Have Learned from Teachers Pursuing Inclusive Education, reflects my thinking about inclusive education. It also reflects some of the findings from research that I will discuss in this presentation. It's about working with teachers, teacher students in developing inclusive education. It's about supporting them while they are exploring inclusion. And I want to highlight the exploration. As the global monitoring report of this year, which was presented in the morning, and many researchers state, inclusive education is a process of identifying barriers to learning. But it is also about mobilizing a range of resources for learning and development. And when we hear the word resources, we usually tend to think about more money, more people, more staff, more learning materials. However, the biggest resource is ourselves, and it is a resource that can be increased, which doesn't happen that often with other types of resources. The resource in ourselves is learning, new pedagogical approaches that we come up. Inclusive education doesn't just happen. It is about teachers, school leaders, decision and policymakers, researchers constantly seeking appropriate means to education, to educate all together. And the focus of my presentation, therefore, is in professional learning as experienced by teachers. The pictures in my presentation are mostly from Ethiopia, and the voices of teachers are from Finland. I tried to strike a good balance between my two homes over the past years. I will start with a bit of a framework. A few years back, well, actually a few years is already 8 years, the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education developed what they call a profile of inclusive teachers. This involved a wide consultation and research. And the purpose of this profile and this work was to, first of all, to identify a framework of core values and areas of competence that could be applicable to any initial teacher education program. I would say that this framework is useful also in developing teachers in service programs, but also reflecting teacher practice in schools that are aiming to greater inclusion. Secondly, the framework aimed at highlighting the essential core values and areas of competence that are necessary for preparing all teachers to work in inclusive education, considering all forms of diversity. So we are not talking only about disability or range of special educational needs, but also about diversity emanating from language, context, educational background, different life orientations, and so on. And that was very interesting what Hanna mentioned, that in most of the policy documents that they had gone through in the document, this kind of broader conceptualization of inclusive education wasn't present. Although many times when we discuss inclusive education, we tend to relate it to a certain groups of learners. The third aim or purpose of this framework was to highlight key factors supporting the implementation of these core values and areas of competence for inclusive education within all teacher education programs. And lastly, which I would perhaps consider as the most important contribution, is that through this framework, we want to reinforce the argument that inclusive education is the responsibility of all teachers, and that preparing all teachers to work for more inclusive settings is the responsibility of all teacher educators. So I have used this framework to kind of look at teachers' values and competencies in their practical work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think for inclusive teachers, valuing the student diversity is the core value. It means that the learner difference is considered as a resource and an asset to education. Although this seems to be rather a trivial observation, dealing with diversity is not so obvious. And I think this idea of valuing student diversity also comes very strongly out of the Global Education Monitoring Report. However, understanding learner diversity requires knowledge of the context where learners live, not only about the location or different life orientation, but also knowledge about the policies and the curricula and other guidelines that steer education in general and practice in schools in particular. In a series of studies that I carried out with my colleagues in the northernmost part of Finland a few years back, it was interesting that the teachers identified poverty and social problems as a major barrier to learning. Although the teachers couldn't do much to change the social or economic conditions of the environment, they knew how a small community could be used for support. And I will quote two voices of teachers who talk about their context. The quote: "We take holistic care of learners, and as we know everybody, we know where they come from and what kind of difficulties they have at home, economical and all that. So we try to help them." End quote. And another teacher, quote: "The family background impacts on learning. When I used to teach in another village, there was no tradition of doing schoolwork at home. The children could not understand it because there was no such history at home. Paper and pencil are not present from early childhood here in our neighborhoods. Even our upbringing traditions are more functional, somehow freer and a kind of different. And our personalities are more, we are more unhurried." End quote. Well, this picture portrays another reality. This is a secondary school in Ethiopia. And I can say that these students have already overcome many hurdles, as only half of the population of secondary school age enter secondary school in Ethiopia. Maybe these students have families that don't need them to work in the fields. Maybe their families have some education and can support them. Most learners in Ethiopia are first generation to become literate, which creates huge challenges for the curriculum and for the teachers. In this school, they recognized that poverty, again, is the main risk for a dropout, as well as lack of space at home for studying. Therefore, the school mobilized considerable funds from the neighboring community to provide basic necessities for students from poor families. And teachers organized after-hour study groups for those students who couldn't study at home. Quite interesting approaches to address inequity. What I'm saying is that we cannot ignore where we work as teachers, where learners live, and what is their life history. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the huge inequality in ways in which education systems have managed to respond to the fundamental right to education. While in Finland, a shift to distance education was relatively well organized, in rural areas of Ethiopia, it was estimated that less than 3 out of 10 learners had any access to education during the school closure. We can also see that the world is becoming even more diverse as a result of increasing mobility. I'm not talking only about immigration, but also mobility within countries and continents. It is likely that our student populations will become more diverse in the future. We shouldn't be afraid. Rather, I think we should see this as an opportunity for learning. Inclusive teachers base their teaching on the conviction that there is potential for change in current achievement and that things can change as a result of what happens and what people do in present. We talk about transformability, the potential for transforming learning capacity. To me, inclusive pedagogy is not only about adaptations or modifications, but it must have broader purposes. There should be elements of affective purposes, for example, strengthening confidence, security. There should be social purposes, for example, increasing acceptance, belonging. Hanna was also talking about this. And there should be intellectual purposes, ensuring access, relevance, meaning. In our research in the north of Finland, we found out that the successful inclusive teachers are confident that all learners have the potential to become better learners. So it is a question of our beliefs. These teachers saw learning capacity as an interplay between external influences, internal resources, and the learner's state of mind. Therefore, learning capacity is both collective and individual. It is about how learners work and operate as a group and the kind of opportunities and resources made available to them. So I'm going back to my previous point, the importance of understanding the whole context of learning. When the teachers were reflecting their practice in these studies, they emphasized flexibility and creativity. These characteristics might be individual. They can be also developed as a part of key professional skills. Because these teachers understood learning diversity, emanating from the contextual and individual factors, they had become better in identifying barriers to learning. And this was what they felt themselves. Based on this understanding and identification, they invented flexible, innovative approaches that worked in their locality and culture. They built learning on learners' strengths and actual levels of skills or knowledge rather than assumed learning needs based on age or progression with textbooks. In other words, they applied learner-centered activities. Learner diversity is present in all heterogeneous learning groups, and effectively inclusive learning groups would be heterogeneous. It is at the core of inclusive education. And we found out in our fieldwork that the social problems and disaffection manifested in inappropriate behavior, and a range of classroom management strategies needed to be developed. While one strategy might have worked for one group, another strategy had to be developed to other groups. And coupled with classroom management skills, curriculum differentiation skills were essential skills that the teachers have developed by working and pursuing inclusive education. These curriculum differentiation skills included aspects such as the ability to identify core and complementary contents, to connect general context to local conditions, adaptation, adjustments, and modifications in pedagogy, as well as the courage to employ new methodologies and technologies. And I was really impressed about the courage that the teachers showed in trying out new ways, new approaches, new ways of thinking, but also doing things in the classroom. I will quote again a teacher, a voice of one of the teachers who talked about their practice. We estimate that about 9% of the learners in the upper grades, refers to grade 8, 9, are at risk of marginalization, or they are somehow special in the sense that probably they won't have much success in academic skills. So we've made individual plans for them. Our crafts teacher takes these boys with him so that he can work with him. Usually it's something that is needed at the school. They work in the crafts classroom, they plan the work, they do all the measurements, they procure the material, and then they make it. There are all kinds of skills involved. Sometimes these boys study a certain subject as a part of the lesson, and then they continue with their work in the crafts classroom. But most importantly, they are working on something according to their strengths, crafts or maintenance. They are good in those kind of activities, so that they would succeed in something. In Ethiopia, only about 10% of children and youth with disabilities have access to education for many reasons. And I have chosen this picture. There are 2 deaf learners, 1 hearing learner, and their teacher. In an increasing number of schools in Ethiopia, sign language is taught to deaf and hearing students alike. It is not only the deaf students who need sign language for communication. It is the hearing students and their teachers who also need sign language for the communication. And it's also to ensure that the deaf students can participate in education on an equal basis. By ensuring adequate means of communication, these schools promote learning of all learners and provide opportunities to fulfilling one's potential. Many researchers have pointed out that inclusive education requires all teachers to work in teams. Collaboration, partnership, and teamwork are essential approaches for all teachers and should be welcomed. I would also say, and should be also practiced. In addition, collaborative teamwork supports professional learning with and from other professionals. Teaching is essentially about learning, and therefore teaching requires constant learning. We talk about lifelong learning. In Finnish teacher education, I think there is a lot of emphasis on reflection so as to build foundation for to become reflective practitioners. In our research, teachers who aim to develop inclusive practice were constantly reflecting their practice, and many of them had also adopted co-teaching approach as a part of collaborative learning and partnerships. They worked in different kinds of combinations with special teachers, with social workers, with different subject teachers together, and so on. Whatever the combination, they emphasized that in addition to professional support, co-teaching helped them to share the workload, relieve stress, and help them to become better teachers through reflection and sharing. I think this is very, very important. Collaboration helps to become better teacher. Some of the teachers also emphasized that the assessment of learning is more precise and justified when it is jointly carried out, thus contributing to fairness. Collaborative practice in teaching brings benefits to students and serves also as a part of lifelong learning about teaching. The teachers in our studies, they saw the value of collaboration in providing more holistic, appropriate, or targeted support to learners through problem solving and lesson development. They recognized collaboration as a resource for good practice, good pedagogy, and a means to extend what is currently available in school and in the wider community. And the teachers also acknowledged that through collaboration, they could develop their professional competence and in doing so, facilitate collective learning. To conclude my presentation, I would like to take further the idea of teaching is about learning. I will share a finding from an action research on early childhood education that I was involved in before I took up the assignment in Ethiopia. I was involved in the development work of an inclusive early childhood education practice in a municipality in Finland. After 1 year piloting and extensive training, all early childhood education centers and all different groups within the centers started the process of developing inclusion. That means that the children with diverse needs were spread across the groups rather than concentrated in certain groups. The staff was provided with additional training on inclusive early childhood pedagogy, and they were encouraged to reflect their practice and develop it so as to accommodate and respond to the diverse needs of children that they had in their groups. The whole process was very instructive and it would deserve a presentation of its own. But I want to talk about the professional learning that took place in that process. The picture shows an example of discussions that took place in each of the early childhood education centers and within each group within the center. My apologies, the text is only in Finnish, but the title of the discussion, what does an inclusive early childhood education center look like, reveals the kinds of reflections the staff undertook. We found out that training, be it pre or in-service training, it's not enough as such to transform education towards inclusion. It requires collective learning, which is much more than just individual learning. But on the other hand, collective learning depends on individual learning and individual attitudes. And there are certain elements that are required so that this kind of collective learning can take place. I have called them enabling conditions. First of all, the leadership. The leadership needs to show expectation for collective learning. They need to provide opportunities of training, and most importantly, they need to follow up the progress that is being made. So that there is a constant feedback also on the progress. Secondly, on the individual level, there needs to be a recognition of each other's skills, developing a sense of trust, equality, and team building. If we want to develop collective learning, we need to adopt these kind of ideas within ourselves, but also in relation to others. Well, of course, not all early childhood education centers in that municipality and not all groups in those centers made similar progress, but we concluded something very interesting that takes us back to the importance of values again. This is what I have called as a cycle of positive professional development. 2 years after the process started in that municipality, we could see how engagement with the values and principles of inclusive education, coupled with training, that led to collective learning. And that seemed to strengthen self-efficacy, which in turn encouraged the use of new approaches in practice. And when these new approaches were used in practice, there were experiences of success. It reinforced the staff belief in inclusive values, policies, principles, and thus strengthening the belief in inclusive education. And if we go around the cycle of professional development, it is a very powerful resource that we have available. I would say easily available. In these early childhood education centers, the staff who had ended or who were as a part of this positive professional development cycle, they perceived their work as a multifaceted and interactive problem-solving process related to various aspects of inclusive education, rather than separate solutions for daily practice. So they really embedded their practice on the values and principles of inclusive education. So they could frame their pedagogy within the values underpinning inclusive education, thus changing fundamentally their understanding and the functioning of inclusive early childhood education centers. And I would like to finish my presentation, again, one voice of a committed early childhood educator. I hope this message will encourage all of us who are and who have been working in developing inclusive education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sai. And we have received 2 questions so far. And the first one is about training. And this question is addressed to both of you. And the question is something like this: that what do you think? What kind of training is needed, and on what topics in that training should be then covered? What kind of and on what? Perhaps Sai starts because you are on the screen at the moment.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think this is a question that is posed very often, and it's not easy to respond. But based on the experience that we had this from this early childhood education development, we realized that there needs to be that was mainly in-service training provided there. We understood that it is very important to have in-depth discussions about the values and principles of inclusive education, to spend time in developing and kind of developing a shared understanding of what inclusive education in that specific context is about. In addition to that, initially we worked in such a way that the early childhood educators, they were provided with all kinds of like a skills training, let's say in a neuropsychological approaches, in signed language, in using the support signs and behavior management and so on. But after a few years, we realized that it was not very helpful to have this kind of like a same kind of training for all the staff, because they didn't get to use the skills in their groups with the children. So after a few years, the approach was changed, and the educators were provided with a training that they needed at the moment in the group where they were working, because after the training they could take all those ideas back to their work immediately and start practicing it. Because once you attend a training, you don't actually, well, you get some ideas, but you master it only after practicing it in a real life situation. So that was the approach that was used, and which proved to be quite successful.
Okay, and Hanna, what are your ideas on this?
Thank you, Sai. I tried to build upon what you just said about in-service training. I have facilitated training on diversities in workplaces as in-service training, and I've also been teaching about education for diversities in different universities. And something I have found to be the most transformative approach is when we do go back to the fundamental ideas of equity, and when we position ourselves within the equity frameworks, when we actually look into our own values, positionalities, and try to recognize the experiences of inclusion and exclusion from our own lives, recognizing some of the privileges. So I think this kind of individual level, so soul searching and then sharing those discoveries with colleagues has been fundamentally important. But of course, we shouldn't stop there. But I think the individual work serves as a good ground to then start thinking about ourselves as inclusive professionals, and it helps us to create a connection with the learners and the people we are serving in our roles, and that brings us to discussing our own practice. Probably, as Josai also mentioned, linking the learning process with the actual working contexts, and trying to observe some issues from the actual practice. For example, through observing each other's teaching has been really valuable. And then I think for professionals, it's also extremely important to remember that we alone cannot simply serve everyone and change everything, no matter how much we want it to. Teachers often feel helpless with the enormous tasks they are facing. Let's say a teacher who teaches a class of 100 students with minimal training on different, diverse learning needs. So I think it's also a part of the professional training should be about recognizing the limitations of what is possible and what is the responsibility of the teacher, and then understanding the structural issues that influence the way we work, and learning to get support from different sources, because teachers are very much left alone in their work and too often. So I think part of inclusion should be about recognizing the different roles and responsibilities that we as professionals have.
Okay, thank you. And there is a question addressed to Hanna, and it's about this partnership and collaboration and sharing information, so that how this expertise in inclusion can be practically shared with low-income countries.
Thank you for the question. I think there was also another a point made by the same person asking, are the small steps we are taking enough? We have initiatives here and there, and partnerships that keep breaking up because of funding cycles and so on. I don't think anything is ever enough when we come to enhancing quality education and inclusion. And that's why it's so important for us to focus on what actually makes sense, try to identify high impact forms of collaboration. And that of course requires long-term partnerships, sustained funding, and a focus on widening impact of any activity that is initiated. Activities funded by external partners cannot serve the whole system, and not for a very long time. So we always need to plan for scaling up and institutionalizing the collaboration. I think the current situation provides us new opportunities, especially if we have the connections over the internet, which definitely is not the case in large parts of the world. Where we are connected, I could see a lot of opportunities for peer support and co-teaching across different countries and contexts. We could actually have professional dialogue among teachers and teacher educators, student teachers, in order to understand different dimensions of inclusion, as an example.
Okay.
I hope I responded.
Thank you. And then there is a question to both of you, I guess, that are there good examples of in-service training models in low-resource settings? And perhaps, Hanna, you could continue, and Sai continue after you. In-service training models.
I was actually very pleased to see a colleague from Zanzibar attending the session. We have Wanakami Samir following us, and I had the pleasure of reviewing her doctoral dissertation last year, and that research was an excellent evidence of high impact in-service training of teachers in Zanzibari schools on active learning and thereby also inclusive approaches to education. Also in our report, we did find several good high impact examples. So I would encourage you to go back to our report we produced for the Global Education Monitoring Report. But yes, there definitely are good examples, and they may not necessarily be, fully traveling from a context to another, but there's definitely a lot we can learn from projects done in different parts of the world.
Well, I agree very much with Hanna that there are good examples, but they might not be applicable in all contexts. We know that the contexts are very different, and ways of providing training is different, but also the how to say the starting point for training is also very, very different. In reflecting my experience in Ethiopia, I would like to encourage the kind of approaches that will be embedded within the existing systems. Inclusive education very often is brought in as a kind of additional idea, additional approach, and then it seems to sometimes result in resistance. That okay, this is another thing that we need to do, and so on. In Ethiopia, there were, I would say, serious efforts in including the ideas of inclusive education across all the in-service training programs that were provided within the context of improving the quality of education. So when there were, for example, in-service training for English teachers or mathematics teachers, there were also elements of inclusive thinking, inclusive pedagogy in those trainings as well. It's a very small, in a way, it's just a small part, but I would say that that as a part of kind of the professional identity that people have. I'm a maths teacher, I'm an English teacher. It is easier to adopt the kind of inclusive way of thinking if it comes as a part of my own discipline. There were some very encouraging progress over the couple of years now. unfortunately, the COVID-19 also impacted on that training and the kind of approaches that were adopted in that training. So now what needs to be thought about again is that how we can actually do in-service training as long as the situation is as it is now. As Hanna mentioned, in places where we can be connected virtually, that's not a big issue. Although there are also challenges related to e-learning pedagogy and all this interaction, but many teachers don't have access to internet, even computers, or even electricity. So we have to be innovative, and I'm sure that we can find we can find new ideas, but it has to be contextualized and it has to fit into the context. And I think the danger of kind of stating the good examples is that it's easy to say that, okay, this is a good example, we take this, but it might not work for many reasons. But I think the value of these kind of examples is that I can learn from them, and I can then think about what is it where I am, who are the teachers that I'm working with, so that the training that will be provided really supports their work and improving education in general.
Thank you. And there is a question mainly for Sai, but perhaps Hanna could comment as well after Sai. So that the cycle of positive professional development Sai presented is very strong example of making progress in inclusive education. Do you have any ideas on how this kind of cycle could be included in pre-service teacher education?
Well, I haven't thought about that, because that cycle of positive professional development came about as a part of in-service training and constant development work in early childhood education settings. Well, I haven't thought about that, but I think that's a very, very interesting kind of line of thinking. But and of course it depends on the way in which teacher education is being organized, because the teacher education programs in different countries are very, very different. But that kind of, if I now think aloud, is that I think that in the kind of teacher education systems where there are periods of in-campus studies and work in the schools, there could be some kind of learning process, but the connection between the campus and the school community perhaps would need to be thought out. I will work on that. Good question.
So Hanna, do you want to continue on that?
I would actually love to see the cycle again, if possible. While Sai is looking for it, I would like to re-emphasize a point made by Sai Juma in the chat about the need to invest more on pre-service teacher education for inclusion in order to reduce the negative attitudes and the feeling that inclusive education is an added burden to in-service teachers. And I think we're coming now very close to thinking about the cycle.
Okay.
I think my response again comes down to the importance of a holistic, fundamental discussion of values behind education. If we start teaching about inclusion by mentioning different disabilities or different, learning needs, that might easily make us feel extremely weak and unresourceful, and that might give future teachers a lot of pressure on how on earth can I respond to all these different needs. But if we do approach inclusion as something that is there and that is the ultimate objective of everything that we do, things might look a little different. And yes, connecting the teacher education program cycle with frequent engagement with different types of schools, different types of students, that might help us to develop a professional development path in a meaningful way, and definitely trying out new things. And I think this doesn't only apply to in-service training. This should very much be the spirit of pre-service training of teachers, especially in the contexts where we have the luxury of training teachers for a rather long period of time. I am fully aware that there are countries where teachers are trained through very quick, fast track programs. I think some of the worst are around 6 months, and developing such a fundamental process into these programs is obviously a challenge. But getting a feel of the realities of schools, coming back to the university to reflect on what has been observed and experienced, would definitely be a meaningful way of developing professionally already during the pre-service training. But I really appreciate the items in the cycle that Sai presented to us. Thank you for that.
Okay, and the next question is relating to school leaders. How have you seen the role of school leaders when it comes to competence management in inclusive education teaching? Perhaps Hanna, continue first, and then Sai.
I think the only thing I would like to mention here is the importance of leaders' attitudes. If the school leader talks about inclusion as something that's an extra burden, I think it definitely influenced the way the whole school community looks at inclusion. So I hope school leaders would recognize the huge power in influencing attitudes, and they might need more training to be a little more constructive about the topic. And this definitely applies to many countries at very different levels.
It is hard for me to respond to the part of the question that what is already there, what could be more. I have been away from Finland for some time now. I need a lot of in-service training myself as well. But I would like to echo what Hanna said, that there needs to be a kind of single message across the leadership. If the school works towards inclusive education, there needs to be opportunities for learning, developing the collective learning, collective competence. Not all teachers need to know everything, but together as a collective, we are much more capable than individuals as such, and I think that's very, very important. And as I mentioned in my presentation, what we found out in this development process in only one municipality in Finland, it was really important that the leaders, the early childhood center directors, that they regularly followed up what was going on in the centers, in different groups. How did the staff put in practice in what they have been the skills that they have gained from different training, but also engaging in discussions with the staff and supporting them at the times of turbulence or at the times of despair when they had the feeling that they don't know what to do or they were exhausted and so on. And I think that's the most important role of the school leaders. In terms of competence management, I know that in many contexts, it's not the school leaders who actually get to choose their staff. So they don't know the kind of competencies or the kind of competencies that are needed there. But in Finland, it is well, very often it is the school leadership that appoints the new teachers and new staff, and those are the kind of situations that the school leaders can look at. What are the kind of competencies? What are the kind of skills? What are the kind of like internal chemistry that they want to create in the school? In order to make inclusive education progress. I remember, that was a long time ago, but I remember as I was appointed as a special education teacher to a school in Finland, the principal asked me directly that will you work here to promote inclusion, or do you want to do special needs education?
Thank you. Perhaps I continue a little bit here, so that this is close to this learning organization topic that has been discussed decades already, and we hear from you that schools and the whole society have to change here, and then this is very much kind of cultural interpretation, how the whole school sector should be organized and run, and we know that our interpretation reflect long history, how we have done this education, public education, more than 100 years in many countries. So we are dealing here cultural forces, and how to change this old way of thinking so that there is more room for new practices and new ways for teamwork, etc. So that this cultural interpretation of schools is perhaps one of the key factors that make our progress so slow. Or what are your experiences on this matter? Perhaps I continue.
Well, I would pose you a question. Where does the change start? It starts from here. It starts for myself. When we are talking about cultural change, the culture starts to change when people start to change and behave in a different way. So when what I have seen in some of those processes on inclusive education that I consider as the most kind of inspiring is really this cultural change within that context. And it starts from individuals, about their learning, about the collective learning, and the courage that they start working in a different way. Of course, it's not easy because it's not easy to change oneself. And it's not easy because I have to work with other people. I have to deal with the parents. I have to work with the people who are against the idea of inclusive education. There are many controversies around inclusive education, and I have to deal with that. That's what I call the turbulence, and it's not something that we go to the school on Monday and say that, well, from this day on we will be inclusive. It's not that. It takes time, and well, I have been looking at inclusive education since 1990s already. I can see a progress. It is slow, but I have also seen a very, very good practice, and I would say that if we just give up and we think that it's so difficult to change these huge systems, yes, it is, but it is possible, and that's what I rely on.
Okay, thank you. And Hanna, do you want to comment on that cultural change?
Markku, I will need to ask you to repeat the question because I was dropped off. There are apparently connectivity issues within Finland as well.
So the question was relating to the school culture, so that we have a long history how we run schools, and we have learned that, and now we are trying to develop something new to change that towards more inclusive practices, so that how to deal this kind of deep cultural, even transformative change.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As a person who comes from outside the special needs education field, for me the question has been raised more through including learners who speak other languages than the school language. I have also worked through the gender approach to inclusion, and I have found that, for example, gender is something that none of us can somehow ignore or escape. So bringing in different diverse diversities to the discussion on inclusion might have helped many schools and individuals working in the schools to relate with the notion of inclusion. Again, we come to the issue of contextuality. What are the kinds of diversities and the groups of people that are a challenge for our schools to include? So this is where we need to understand the contextual particularities, and if we talk about inclusion through these different dimensions and qualities, I think the discussion comes more possible, and then we can start working towards the change. And I do agree with Sai. If I take an example of how gender is talked about in schools in Finland, there definitely is an observable change there. We are so much more aware and responsive to gender diversity than we used to be.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we could come back a little bit to this pre-service teacher education, and And this learner diversity and cultural diversity is now present, and also different forms of teamwork as well. How can we then include all these to teacher education, so that these student teachers really learn these skills during their pre-service education, and not like part of in-service training? How would you like to change our teacher education programs, if you have a power? Since Hanna is smiling there already, perhaps you respond first.
Thank you. If I had the power, I would want student teachers to meet across study programs, across age cohorts, to engage in active dialogue with future teachers from different parts of the world in order to give them experiences of different ways of approaching teaching and teacherhood. I would not want to have separate courses on gender, on disability, on interculturality, but I would love to see some very broad themes brought in across the different across the content of the programs. And I would also want to encourage student teachers to select certain lenses that they use to filter the program content through, whether it is, let's say, linguistic diversity or gender or disability, but to sort of practice looking at each part of the program from an inclusive perspective, and then have a dialogue between the different perspectives. But I would definitely want to get away from single thematic courses that are taught separately to students from different study programs, separately to students studying through different languages. I think if we want to become inclusive, we should get rid of a lot of these structures in teacher education. But this is me dreaming.
Okay, thank you.
I have quite similar ideas than Hanna does, but I also think that the pre-service training can't address all the possible situations that the teachers might encounter during their career. I think, and based on my own experience as a teacher, but also working with schools and teachers, I think that the importance of the pre-service training is to provide how to say, the kind of professional to develop a kind of professional identity that looks at teaching as a learning, and the part of that. And part of that learning is the interaction that happens in the classroom, and how I take that interaction as a part of my own learning. When I go home as a teacher and I reflect what happens there, I connect my reflection to what I know from research, or I might look for more information and so on, and also to do that collectively. So I think at least in Finnish teacher education nowadays, there is much more this kind of reflection and practice on interaction and reflection, and compared to the times when I was trained as a teacher. But I think the kind of the message that I would like to pass on to pre-service teacher education really is that it is a starting point for a kind of lifelong learning to become a teacher. So adopting that kind of idea that when I get my degree and the paper that says that now you have completed your studies, it doesn't mean that it will end there. That's the start for kind of really mastering the work.
Okay, thank you. One critical issue here is that we need more student-centered pedagogy at school, and a consequence of that is that we also have to modify how we view assessment. So is it like individual progress, or is it then a more collective one? And what do you think? How should we modify student assessments when we are moving towards inclusive education? Perhaps I continue.
Well, I think that would be a topic for another for another session to discuss. There has been, as far as I have been able to follow what is going on in Finland, there has been a lot of discussion about assessment and the purposes of the assessment, and to what extent assessment is fair, and is it fair across and through the system, because we don't use standardized test as a way of ranking students that much. At the moment, I don't have a very kind of very clear idea or solution of how we should work on that. I think well, one way of approaching as well, I'm thinking of assessment as a part of a process of developing inclusive education. And if we want to celebrate diversity, if we want to acknowledge different kind of success that is possible, then we need to provide feedback on that. So and teachers do that. They do that. But I wonder whether all kinds of achievements are equally valued. Sometimes I feel that when we are talking about assessment, we are talking mainly about so-called academic subjects, and then we don't put that much value on, for example, on social emotional skills. We don't put that much value on aspects like being a good friend and so on, or being sensitive to diversity and so on. So I don't have a response to that at the moment, but I think also my thinking at the moment is that I think we should be also kind of more diverse and more sensitive to diversity also in our assessment. We should give credit to different kind of skills and also to the achievements that students can achieve also as individuals, because we know that some students might perform at a very high level, and there are students who might never reach that level. But we should give credit all the achievements that they get at their own level as well. So this is not a very coherent response, because I think it's really very complicated, and also the question, of course, is that what do we use the assessment for? If it's a feedback, if it's to support learning of the learners, then I think it's a good thing. But if we use the assessment in terms of, well, like a ranking, or nowadays we use certain achievements, grades for university selection and so on, that's not very inclusive.
Okay, thank you. Hanna.
Thank you. I could try to bring in more of a structural perspective to the discussion around active learning and assessment. And I base this on my experience of working with 2 countries in the Horn of Africa, where in both countries active learning is very much a policy priority, and it's been there in the policy documents. And also teacher education in both countries is serious about promoting active learning as an approach to teacher education pedagogy. And I feel there is a very fundamental understanding of what active learning is about and what it should be. But when we link the discussion around active learning with assessment, we are basically facing a brick wall in between the 2 worlds. Even assessment practices in higher education in these 2 countries are strictly based on commanding content, on formal multiple choice tests and examinations where students only study the content and respond to questions individually. So there's an absolute mismatch between the aims of promoting active learning and the existing assessment frameworks, and teacher educators are really struggling to figure out how to overcome this wall. But because if you put it bluntly, the programs are packed with content. So a wise teacher would want the students to succeed in the assessment. So they would focus on delivering the content so students can succeed in the examinations. But then there's absolutely no space left for active learning and interaction in the studies. So how you as a wise professional will balance these 2. And assessment structures are, in many countries, they are something that are just given from above. Individual universities, not even mentioning individual academics, don't have anything to say to the approaches to assessment. So I think this is a very good example of lacking dialogue between different equally important parts of the system and the ways we see them. And then on a very practical level, this probably applies to all levels of education. What actually signals learning? I mean, if we had the freedom to start assessing, let's say, participation in the class, I have come across situations where teachers are really surprised to see the level of noise in the classroom. Can that signal learning? Is it because we are quite used to rewarding students who keep quiet and who take their notes and who respond correctly to our exam questions, but does that actually assess learning that is happening? So this is probably more of a cultural issue. Like, what do we recognize as learning and successful successful learning activity. And these are examples of two issues that I have really thought about a lot with colleagues from these two African countries on how on earth can we start generating change in these kinds of issues. And as Markku says, active learning is very much about inclusion and recognition of different approaches to learning and education. So there's a lot of dialogue to be done around this, and it's always contextual.
Okay, so we have some 5 minutes time, and I would like to open one rather complex question to the end, and asking quick comments from Hanna and Sai on that, so that in many countries these standards for teacher education are developed, and teacher education programs are then monitored that they are meeting the standards. Also, standards could be then developed to monitor teachers in the field. So what do you think? Is this standards movement valid when we try to develop further this inclusive education practice globally taken, or is it impossible to create inclusive education standards? So what do you think about inclusive education standards in general? Hanna first.
I knew you were coming up with difficult questions. I definitely think we need some standards and some measures in order to see where we are. I mean, there's no way around us. And how could we ever have a discussion about inclusive education internationally or globally if we would not have some agreed definitions, standards, measurements, and so on. But as I said in my example about assessment structures, it can definitely constrain our genuine efforts to find contextually meaningful ways to work on inclusion. So I think it's more about the scale and strictness of the standards that's we're talking about. But I think that's all I can say at this point. But yeah, we need to recognize both the pros and cons.
Okay. How about Sai?
Well, I think I'm a little bit allergic to the word standard. I would prefer indicator or something else. I think some like an indicators or certain descriptions or definitions can be useful in developing inclusive practice, inclusive classrooms. They shouldn't be used as a kind of assessing the teacher performance, but I think these kind of indicators, or even if we use the word standards, can be useful in terms of developing the work. But what I have realized is that that very often when these standards are being created, it is very difficult to set the standards within the context. So even in the countries of the North, the contexts are very, very different. And although the teachers would have the same training and so on, when they go to their schools, they work in a different environment. And many things that are happening in schools are beyond their hands. So if the standards kind of, if they are used in a way of like ranking the schools or teachers in a certain category or level of inclusive education, I don't think that's meaningful. But if these standards are being used as a part of a professional development, as a part of collective learning, as a part of a broader development work, they might be and could be useful. So that's where I stand.
Okay, thank you so much for your opinions and ideas. I feel that this has been a really good discussion, and perhaps we could conclude here that that when we are thinking of progress in inclusive education, this old verb is good for us, so that where there is a will, there is a way. So, and we want to have will now, all of us. Thank you so much of this, and in the program, and now it's a coffee break, and we are closing this session. Thank you for everybody.
Thank you to everyone who was with us.
Thank you very much for the discussion and the questions.
That was a wonderful conclusion, Markku. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to both the presenters and the moderator. Now we have a 30 minutes break, and after the break, the thematic sessions begin. We hope you have chosen a session by now and signed in. So what you need to do after the break is go to your thematic session page that you've chosen and click on the link to get into the meeting. That's it. Now only your session is visible to you, but in some time after the event, all the thematic sessions will be visible to you again. Hope you enjoy the sessions. You'll also have some JYU students helping you in the thematic sessions if you need any support from the university side. And then after the thematic sessions and the break, if you still feel like watching some short videos about the university, Finnish school and inclusion, you can access the movie night and informal discussion page on Housepace. Watch the movies and enter any of the informal discussion meetings on the same page to chat about the movies. The informal discussion starts at 5:30 our time, Finnish time. And then tomorrow morning at 10, you again enter your own thematic session page and follow the link to enter the meeting. If you still have questions, then you can post them on the front page, in the welcome page, in the discussion box. And yeah, see you for the panel discussion at 1:30 Finnish time tomorrow. Thank you so much, all of you.